Today's hearing will come to order. Today's hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee is entitled Examining VA's Police Force. The subcommittee will examine the policies, operations, and management of the Department of Veterans Affairs Police Force. A major focus of the hearing is a recent Office of Inspector General report. The department's police force has a vital mission. VA police protect the veterans, staff, visitors, and property at VA facilities. More than 4,000 police not only respond to crime and keep the peace across more than 150 VA facilities, they do this in a healthcare setting, which adds to both the importance and complexity of the police mission. A police officer may be the first VA employee they see as they enter the facility, and officers interacting continually with veterans who are awaiting medical treatments or arranging for follow-up care. And the VA police often encounter veterans sitting alone on a bench on the grounds or in the parking lot. I think it's correct to say the VA police are the part of the healthcare mission of the department. The tragedy of veteran suicide underscores the importance of our VA police officers and their work. Since the beginning of the year, 7 veterans have committed suicide within the Department of Veterans Affairs facilities. VA police are often the first to encounter veterans during an attempt and are part of the response team. The importance of VA police duties and responsibilities means that we can and should find ways to improve their operations. In December, the Inspector General released a report examining VA police. Central to the findings were serious problems with the governance structure. To put it more simply, the Inspector General asked the question, who is in charge? I was surprised to read in the IG report that the answer is actually pretty complicated. Each VA hospital administrator is in charge of its own small police force of a couple dozen officers. Each hospital administrator determines the number of police and level of resources and is responsible for implementing policies about security, use of force, and hiring and firing for officers. Meanwhile, 2 separate offices at the VA headquarters establishes policies and handles oversight. That is why today's hearing we have multiple people from VA headquarters. The Inspector General report was clear in finding that, quote, VA did not have adequate and coordinated governance over its police program to ensure effective management and oversight. It found, quote, confusion about police program roles and authority. The IG made several important recommendations to clarify leadership and address some critical problems. However, I understand the IG recommendations have not yet been implemented, nor have we seen new police policies from headquarters. In addition, there are workforce-related concerns, including questions as to whether VA police have adequate staffing resources, including a very high vacancy rate. According to the IG, 40% of VA medical facilities have a vacancy rate among police of 20% or higher. The subcommittee has also heard of other concerns, including how VA handles allegations involving inappropriate use of force and potential violations of veteran civil rights. We are here today to find solutions and learn how the department will address the challenges faced by VA police. I look forward to the testimony of today's witnesses, and with that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Bergman for 5 minutes for any opening remarks he may wish to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Comprised of nearly 4,200 federal law enforcement officers, the Department of Veterans Affairs Police maintain physical security at VA facilities and ensure patient, visitor, and employee safety. According to the Office of Inspector General, VA's police force is one of the top 10 largest law enforcement organizations in the federal government. Running such a large, decentralized entity requires clear lines of authority and vigilant oversight. In its December 2018 report, the Office of Inspector General found several areas of concern within the VA police program, many of which stem from the fact that Veterans Health Administration and the Office of Security and Law Enforcement are jointly responsible for different aspects of the police program. OSLE is part of the VA's central office under the auspices of the Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration. OSLE writes the police policies, trains the officers, investigates criminal incidents at VA facilities, and inspects local medical center police units for compliance. However, badged officers do not report to OSLE. Rather, they report to the medical center's chief of police, who reports to the facility director, who in turn reports to the VISN director, who in turn reports to the Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Operations and Management. This is Bureaucracy 101, a large government agency with 2 separate governing offices which, as OIG found, creates confusion regarding program roles and office authorities. This makes it difficult for VA to effectively monitor its police force, identify trends, and quickly react to issues. For example, OIG found that OSLE did not timely inspect 103 of the 139 medical centers, or 74%, that have VA police units due to a shortage of inspectors. This means that facility police departments lost timely feedback, which is critical for process improvement. Moreover, on top of the delayed inspections, the policies for which the inspectors were evaluating police unit compliance are often outdated and in need of revision. I understand that VA is addressing OIG's recommendations, so I would like assurance that VA has a sense of urgency in addressing its shortcomings and to get a better sense of whether VA is taking appropriate action. To that end, I would like to hear Mr. Missel's assessment of whether VA is on track to close out OIG's recommendations by the end of 2019, and what, if any, barriers exist to doing so. From VA, I want to hear specifics. It is not enough to say that VA is looking into the matter. I would like to know specifically what VA is doing to address OIG's recommendations. Is VA considering a reorganization of the police service? If so, I want to know who is overseeing that review, what opinion or options VA is considering, and what is the timeline for the review. Also, at nearly every hearing, we identify a deficiency that ties back to human resources. This hearing is no exception. The VA's police force has nearly 700 vacancies. That is approximately 17% of the force. In fact, according to OIG, one facility had a vacancy rate of nearly 45%. From VHA, I want to hear specifics concerning what it is doing to improve officer recruitment and retention. I understand that VA is working on addressing career opportunities and pay, but VA has had recruitment and retention authorities available to it under existing law, so how did the police service get to its current state? Can VA document that the current recruitment and retention authorities are insufficient? Was it a lack of oversight, or was it simply not a priority for medical center directors? From OSLE, for example, I want to know who is accountable for developing the police officer staffing model, a project that has been ongoing since 2016. And when will the model be rolled out to all facilities? In the end, we all want VA to provide patients, visitors, and employees with safe environments. To the VA police officer standing post, thank you for your vigilance. I hope that this hearing shines needed light on the program and spurs VA to address the identified deficiencies. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, General Bergman. I will now recognize our first witness, Mr. Michael Missel, Inspector General of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Missel was confirmed by the Senate in his role in 2016. He's had previous experience in both the private sector and at other government agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Office of Inspector General conducts investigations, audits, evaluations, and inspections of VA programs to eliminate waste and fraud, as well as to detect and prevent criminal activity. The subcommittee thanks you for appearing today, Mr. Missel. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Pappas, Ranking Member Bergman, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Office of Inspector General's oversight of the Department of Veterans Affairs Police Program. I would like to highlight the findings from our December 2018 report, Inadequate Governance of the VA Police Program at Medical Facilities. The focus of this audit was to determine whether the VA Police Program has an effective governance structure in place, meets requirements for size and qualifications, and conducts adequate inspections to ensure compliance with policies and procedures. Having an effective governance structure is critically important to the functioning of any organization. We felt this audit was particularly significant as the governance and staffing of the VA police impacts the safety of veterans and their families, VA personnel, and visitors to VA facilities. VA police officers provide security and law enforcement services at VHA facilities, as well as Veteran Benefits Administration offices co-located with VHA facilities and some VA national cemeteries. They are authorized to carry firearms in an official capacity, investigate criminal activity, and arrest individuals on department property for offenses committed within VA's jurisdiction and consistent with other law enforcement agency agreements. VA's police force consists of approximately 4,000 officers at 139 of the 141 VA medical centers, which places it among the 10 largest law enforcement workforces in the federal government. Responsibility for the police program is shared between VHA and the VA Office of Operations, Security, and Preparedness. On September 14, 2018, VA Secretary Robert Wilkie reassigned OSP to the Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration, and the position of Assistant Secretary for OSP was eliminated. Our audit found that VA did not have adequate and coordinated governance over its police program to ensure effective management and oversight for its police officer workforce nationwide. We determined that the governance problems occurred and persisted in part because of confusion about police program roles and authority between VHA and OSP. Governance issues also resulted from a lack of centralized management or clearly designated staff within VHA to manage and oversee the police program. Our audit made 4 general findings. First, VHA and the Office of Security and Law Enforcement, which is part of OSP, did not track and assess police program operations and performance in a systemic and effective manner. Second, VA lacked facility-appropriate police officer staffing models and had extensive shortages of VA police officers. Third, there was not timely inspections of police operations at VA medical centers. As of September 30th, 2017, 103 of the 139 VA medical facilities with police units were not timely inspected. And fourth, VA police officers lacked guidance on investigating any misconduct of facility leaders who manage the police program or control its resources. We made 5 recommendations to the VA Deputy Secretary that focused on the areas of governance, staffing, the inspection program, and processes. VA concurred with all, and the recommendations remain open today. Given the issues we identified in this audit, we started additional audit work on information management within the police program. This work is focused on whether the VA police program's information management strategy and systems provide its leaders and workforce with the information needed to manage and guide operational performance. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Missel. I will now recognize our second witness, Ms. Renee Schinsky, Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Operations and Management of the Veterans Health Administration. Ms. Schinsky has been serving in this role on an acting basis for about 6 months, having previously served as the Network Director for VISN 12 since December of 2016. Ms. Schinsky will provide testimony for all 3 of our Department of Veterans Affairs witnesses, including Mr. Kevin Hanretta, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations, Security, and Preparedness. We have as well Mr. Frederick Jackson, Director of the Office of Security and Law Enforcement. However, all of the VA witnesses appearing today will respond to questions. The subcommittee thanks you all for appearing today. Ms. Schinsky, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Pappas, Ranking Member Bergman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs' current and future policing strategy. I am accompanied today by Kevin Hanretta, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations, Security, and Preparedness, and Frederick Jackson, the Executive Director for the Office of Security and Law Enforcement. VA police officers are federal law enforcement officers who serve critical roles in securing facilities and protecting patients, visitors, employees, and VA property. They provide security and law enforcement services at VHA and VBA offices that are co-located with VHA facilities. The officers sometimes provide security for national cemeteries. VA police are one of our most important ambassadors because they work to resolve incidents across a variety of settings in a humane and respectful manner. Ensuring physical security for VA medical centers can be complicated, as VA must balance safety and security while providing an open and welcoming healthcare environment. Collaboration between law enforcement and healthcare professionals is crucial when responding to violent incidents or police calls for service in the field. To address security issues, VA medical centers have implemented panic buttons, limited guest hours, increased police presence, installed security cameras, enhanced emergency preparedness, and more. Physical security and vulnerability assessments are done at each medical center to identify unique risks, because what works at a rural facility may not apply in an urban facility. The Office of Security and Law Enforcement, OSLE, is responsible for implementing an effective security program within VA by ensuring officers apply 21st century police techniques in the line of duty. Special agents and inspectors within OSLE have responsibility to provide direct technical support to VA police chiefs and facility management within their designated areas. These special agents and inspectors are in regular contact with their respective police chiefs. The VA police officers' methods of law enforcement are unique because our work is conducted in a healthcare setting. We serve a population of trained military veterans suffering from a variety of medical and psychological traumas. Due to this environment, all VA police officers receive specialized training at the VA Law Enforcement Training Center, the LETC. The LETC is located in Little Rock, Arkansas, and is accredited by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Accreditation Board. It's recognized as meeting the highest standards in federal law enforcement training. It is the sole federal government provider of a training program that emphasizes the use of non-physical techniques. All VA police officers go through a 10-week basic course at the LETC. They receive 30 hours of training specific to de-escalation and conflict management, with a special focus on awareness of suicide and its prevention. Officers also complete nearly 24 hours of de-escalation training where they learn skills to affect positive outcomes in real-life scenarios. VA appreciates the reviews done by both the Office of the Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office, as they have led to strengthening of our current VA police service. In response to these reviews, in November of 2018, VHA enhanced our governance structure by hiring a senior security officer. In February of 2019, the VHA executive in charge directed each network to detail a full-time FTE to serve as the VISN police chief. Over the last 4 months, these VISN chiefs have worked to close gaps in inspection results, implement systemic process improvements, promote retention and hiring and growth strategies, and mitigate physical security vulnerabilities. They have been a welcomed asset to the field. VA is looking at ways to improve the governance structure at the department level to ensure better accountability, the proper application of policy, and allow for rapid deployment of assets. They have expanded oversight to include developing a new chief orientation guide, developing a training program for hospital leaders who oversee police services, developing a national mitigation strategy for inspections and physical security vulnerabilities, and enhancing communication and reporting of critical incidents through our leadership structure. We look forward to this opportunity to improve our security operations and keeping our nation's veterans safe while providing the top quality care they have earned. Chairman Pappas, we appreciate the subcommittee's continued support and encouragement in identifying and resolving challenges as we find new ways to care for veterans. This concludes my testimony. My colleagues and I are prepared to respond to any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Ms. Schinsky. Thank you to each of our witnesses for appearing here today. I would now like to open the questioning portion of this subcommittee meeting, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to return to a question that was posed in the IG report, and that's this: who's in charge? This is a critical concern that I think we need to unpack here this morning. So, Mr. Missel, I want to first go to you. I recognize that the Deputy Undersecretary described several improvements that the VA is making to help address the concerns that you have raised. I'm wondering how close this gets to addressing the concerns, and will the improvements that she described here this morning be enough to satisfy your office?
We have not yet had an opportunity to formally assess them. One of our recommendations is for VA to do an assessment of their governance. We're not here, since we're not make management recommendations, we will not suggest which way they should go. We just found deficiencies in the current format, including how it was implemented. So what we're trying to do here is to get a sense from them of what they think works best for them.
Okay. And so to the VA witnesses here today, I'm wondering if you have a specific timetable to address the governance concerns that were raised in the IG report?
We are working on a number of areas that were identified as deficiencies in the OIG report. And as I said, we really appreciate this opportunity to discuss where we're moving. We are looking at a variety of improving our staffing models, and that's scheduled to be completed by the end of September. So we would have a better idea of whether or not our current staffing model needs to be improved. We're also looking at a whole variety of issues, making sure that we have the correct position descriptions, and we will have an appropriate career ladder. One of the issues that we've had is it's hard to retain individuals without having that. These are all pieces of what I think is the governance structure that we need to put in place. The Secretary is looking at all the actions that we are taking and will be evaluating and making a determination as to where we move forward in the future.
Earlier this year at a committee hearing, I asked Dr. Stone, head of the Veterans Health Administration, about this specific issue, and he indicated that a new VA police policy is in the works. I'm wondering if you could comment on the scope of a new policy that might be coming forward, recognizing it may not yet be complete, but I'm curious when we might see further details on that.
My sense would be, again, I believe we are trying to put together all the pieces, trying to address all the things that the IG identifies deficiencies, putting those together and bringing it forward to the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary to look at where we need to move. So I'm not certain exactly when that will be completed, but we do have a number of pieces that will be finalized by the end of the calendar year.
So the steps you indicated that the department is taking in your testimony, those are just a few of the improvements you're looking to make, and if I'm just building off what you just said, we would expect to see a more comprehensive formal package at some point in the near future?
Yes, I certainly believe that that's true. We are working, and not believe, I know that's true. We are working on a whole host of issues on what can we do to improve both our police presence and the governance of those police. One of the last things that any one of us want is confusion at a medical center when there is an issue. I mean, we all want to know what the chain of command is, because that's the way to a successful resolution of any incident. So if there is confusion, we need to correct that.
Well, thank you. One last question before my time's up. I want to address the issue of inspections. And the IG report discovered that 74% of VA medical facilities with police units weren't inspected in a timely manner. And I understand that the VA's Office of Security and Law Enforcement recently hired additional inspectors. Ms. Schinsky, what progress has the VA made in the backlog of police unit inspections, and what trends are you beginning to see in the overall assessments that have been performed?
One of the things, a major impact is hiring additional staff to complete the inspections. I probably will hand this over to Mr. Jackson and Mr. Henretta to give specifics. But right now we're looking at, we hired 10 additional staff in OSLE, and they are moving forward and keeping up with the current schedule. So, Mr. Jackson, can I turn it to you?
Yes, sir. In the IG report, it mentioned the shortages of the agents that were going out to conduct inspections. Since, as of March of 2019 now, the 10 bodies that we had requested are now all on board. Right now, we had scheduled 88 inspections for this year. We're on the glide path to get all of those complete. And so we were thankful for the number of people. As we continue to move forward, we'll continue to look at those additional resources that may be needed to continue to keep that momentum in the right direction.
Well, thank you. I'd like to follow up on this a little bit later, maybe in round two. My time is up right now, but I appreciate your response. In lieu of Ranking Member Bergman having his 5 minutes of questioning, he'd like to defer to Mr. Mast of Florida, who's joining us here today. Welcome. Our colleague, Mr. Mast of Florida, has asked to participate in today's subcommittee hearing, and I would like to request unanimous consent to allow him to join us on the dais. If there are no objections, I now recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for deferring as well. I appreciate getting me up to the front. You didn't have to do that. Thank you. Listen, this is an important issue to me. In a span of about 10 days, back in February, we had both a shooting in the ER of our West Palm Beach VA Medical Center and a suicide. This is something that I believe at the same hearing you were speaking about before, a budget hearing, spoke to Secretary Wilkie about this issue. And he said, to quote him, as a result of what happened at Palm Beach, we have a new security protocol in place that will apply to the entire country. We have undergone, we've already done it, we've undergone a complete review of our security protocols. Not we're going to undertake this, we've undergone a complete review of our security protocols. What happened at Palm Beach with the wounding of 3 medical professionals has led us to revamp the entire way we do security, because I will tell you that the method that was used there was entirely unexpected. I find it hard to believe that somebody pulling a firearm out of a scooter is entirely creative attack. It's not that creative. I am worried that that is unexpected when we look at how we assess threat. But in that, I would like you to tell us, Ms. Schinsky, what has been revamped for the entire country in the way that we do security.
Anytime there is a serious event at any one of our medical centers, we look in depth at what occurred and try to make improvements, because the last thing any of us want is to repeat a mistake that leads to another serious incident. So in this case, I think there are a number of things that occurred. One thing is we are asking at all sites that when people come to the emergency department in a wheelchair or some other of their own a vehicle, they be put in a wheelchair that is owned by the medical center. So that is one way. It's very difficult, I think, when you have somebody who is handicapped. We need to make sure that they're in our owned equipment. So that is one thing that happened.
So to pause, you're saying that now at West Palm Beach VA, if you showed up in a scooter or your own wheelchair, you're going to be transferred into a VA-owned wheelchair.
Correct.
Is that occurring as we speak?
That's what the police are telling me, yes.
Interesting. Please continue.
Yes. Another thing that is, again, at West Palm Beach, sometimes we find that there are concerns that we missed in the vulnerability assessment. So, for example, we are undergoing a construction project at West Palm Beach because we need to make sure that we have adequate coverage by cameras. And that is happening. Another thing, we're also doing more extensive rounding in our parking lots. West Palm Beach is not the only place where that needed to happen. We need to reiterate with everyone that part of our responsibility is making sure that the parking facilities where veterans are coming in are patrolled. So another part of what we're doing as a result of what happened at West Palm Beach.
So let me pause on the patrol there. In the same week, I went to both the West Palm Beach VA and the Orlando VA. You drive to the Orlando VA, they are checking for IDs prior to driving on the campus, albeit I only had to hold any ID up in my window. I didn't have to actually roll down my window. Nobody read it. Nobody looked at it. I could have been anybody. But they did at least ask that I hold an ID up in my window. I think there's some hole in there. West Palm Beach VA, you drive directly onto the campus. Obviously, just between two VAs, there's a little bit of a disconnect between that, what's going on with security. They say you've seen one VA, and there's a lot of truth in that. So to ask a couple specific questions on my local VA, West Palm Beach. One, will there be checking of IDs as people enter the campus? And two, are people's IDs supposed to be checked as they actually enter the hospital? And I ask this because I'm constantly getting photos and reports from my veterans going in and out of the VA, often saying, there's nobody at the front door, there's nobody checking IDs, or sometimes there are. What is the standard of what is actually supposed to occur there, and is it being enforced? And when you talk about needing more agents to go out there to conduct inspections, what about the VA director that's actually in charge of the facility being responsible for their facility?
On a variety of fronts, yes, we should be checking an ID, and I am told that that is now happening at West Palm Beach. So I will verify that and get back to you to make sure that that's happening.
Your standard is somebody enters the hospital, their ID should be checked.
That's what I'm going to verify,
Thank you.
yes. But that is my understanding of one of the things that was to occur as a result of the incident. And completely agree with you. One of the reasons we want to do this review of what should be adequate staffing based on risks, one of the areas that we're continuing to look at, and I think recognizing with what we had heard from GAO and the OIG, that our vulnerability assessments need to be improved at our sites. We will be in the process of doing that, and obviously one of the things that we will consider as we moving West Palm Beach High into that, that implementation period.
Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just tell the story of one of my constituents because I think that it really illustrates a lot of the issues that we're talking about here today. His name is Jean Telfort, and he served 10 years in active duty, during which time he was deployed to Afghanistan. At the time of his separation from active duty, he was determined to have a 100% service-connected disability on top of being diagnosed with PTSD. In November of 2017, he required spine surgery because of an injury that was related to his service. And that surgery was meant to prevent him from becoming suffering paralysis, long-term paralysis. After the surgery, he was told he was going to need physical therapy and occupational therapy, and the VA told him that he could get that in a community-based facility outside of the VA in his community, near his community where he lived. And for a number of months, that's where he went to get his physical therapy and his occupational therapy. At one point, and I've yet to be able to discover why this happened, the VA told him, you're no longer eligible for choice and care in the community, and you've got to come back to a VA facility that was in East Meadow. Near him, but still it was a VA facility. He went to the VA facility to continue his PT and his OT, and when he got there, he was told that they don't have that kind of treatment that they could give him at that location. So he had to go to the VA hospital in Northport to address this issue. He spent 2 days going over there trying to continue his PT and his OT, and this was over a 5-week period during which time the pain was increasing because he was not doing the requisite therapy that he needed post-surgery. On June 6, 2018, he returned to Northport for his second PT appointment and got into a verbal disagreement with the MSA, who was the medical specialist assistant who was behind the counter, who was not, according to other witnesses, was not being very responsive to his needs. She then at some point called the VA police, who showed up. They tried to de-escalate the situation. He sat down. They talked to the MSA, who, in his opinion, was giving wrong information. He engaged the police officer again, and at some point he was literally body slammed onto the ground with his arms twisted behind his back. This is someone who was post-spinal surgery. He informed them of that. I can't breathe. I just had spinal surgery. They kept him on the ground until a physical therapist who had treated him before came and said, he's of no danger. Please take the handcuffs off. They refused to do that. They transported him to the hospital where they handcuffed him to the bed. He was treated by a doctor. I mean, you can imagine not just the physical pain that he was going through, but the emotional and mental anguish that he suffered as a result of this. He asked for the police report, to get the police report so he could, and he wanted to speak to, if they were going to speak to witnesses, he wanted them to get his side of the story as well. They never spoke to him in the first 2 weeks. They told him they would send him the police incident report in the mail. Instead, what he got in the mail was 2 summonses to appear in federal magistrate court for criminal charges of whatever they were. P.S., they shouldn't have been anything. He goes to court. There's no judge. He's told to come back. He goes back on another date. Nothing happens again. This incident keeps going on and on and on. So it implicates not just the difficulty of ensuring that people get the proper health care they need, whether it's within the VA or outside of the VA, but also the treatment that people get if and when it is determined that the VA police need to get involved. So the questions that I have are many. First of all, and by the way, I've asked to speak to the head of the VA police in the district at the VA in Northport, and I have yet, as a congressperson, been able to get any contact information for that individual so that I can try to find out what's going on. We were able to determine that the 2 summonses that this veteran received in federal court are now in the status of deferred prosecution, which, as a former prosecutor, says to me that this is what you do when you say, okay, if you stay out of trouble for 6 months, this case is going to go away. He never saw a judge, never had his day in court, and this is now in the status of deferred prosecution. On top of that, it was discovered during this review that the MSA or others improperly accessed Mr. Telfort's medical records and input information regarding this specific encounter that was factually incorrect, which, I mean, I can't even begin to go into the privacy issues that are implicated there. My understanding is that the people who put that information in improperly accessed his account were reprimanded and retrained. In my opinion, they should have been fired. So I don't even know to whom my question goes to here, but, and I respect the position that the VA police are in. This is a very tense situation that most of them are coming into when they are summoned to a situation that's happening at a VA facility. I get that. I understand that. That's why it's incredibly important for them to get the proper training, especially dealing with individuals who have been diagnosed with PTSD and also have very serious physical manifestations of those injuries as well. So I hope we have a second round. I never do this. I never take up all of my time doing this, but I just felt so compelled to make this case for this veteran. And Mr. Chairman, I would also ask unanimous consent if I could enter a statement, his statement for the record on behalf of my constituent, Mr. Jean Telfort, so it can be a part of this record as well. And I hope we have a second round so we can dig a little deeper into the issues implicated by this one story. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for going over.
Without objection, we'll take that statement, and I do hope we can do a second round here as well. With that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on that question because the same thing happened at the Loma Linda facility a few years ago in Riverside, California, where an individual got frustrated, was going to try to attempt to go to the Long Beach facility. They pretty much took him, slammed him to the ground, hit his head, and he ended up dying of a seizure. In the training that you said that they get, you talk about de-escalation training they receive when they're going through this. How effective is that training? I mean, really, what are they doing over there? And why is this, if they're getting this training, why are we having these situations where individuals are being injured or hurt or killed?
It's really troubling. It's hard for me to sit here and answer questions after hearing, the stories that you're talking about. And certainly, anytime anything like this occurs, we have to go back and question whether or not the things that we're doing are being effective. But I do believe we have looked at our training and continue not only to do the initial training, but retraining of people. We obviously need to do more. We need to take a look at what we can learn in each of these situations where we have something that did not occur as we would hope. I mean, we are trying to do de-escalation not only with the police officers, but in the case that Ms. Rice brought up, really de-escalation on the part of the MSA or the individual who was checking that person in to be seen. We need to make sure that we have that happening across all our medical centers because we're continuing, as I said, to try and balance what's happening in a healthcare environment with people maybe feeling threatened. I know that we are trying to do even more. If I could recognize Mr. Henretta, if you would like to talk about some of the things that we are trying to do for training individuals to ensure that we do not have inappropriate use of force.
Thank you. Again, and I'll also defer to Mr. Jackson, who leads the Law Enforcement Training Center. But I am very proud of the performance of our police officers having completed the Law Enforcement Training Center program. 10 weeks much of it focused on de-escalation scenarios. And so, again, these two incidents are very unfortunate, and I do not believe characterize the VA police in the field serving our nation's veterans. But let me ask Mr. Jackson to specifically talk about the level and type of training that VA police officers receive.
Yes, sir. Years ago, the VA Police Academy was only 5 weeks, and that was in 2009. And we saw the need to increase that to 8 weeks. And one of the reasons was because we wanted to get many more scenario-based situations whereby an officer had to deal with a veteran that was in distress. Even after the 8 weeks, we looked again, and we says, we need to increase this some more to 10 weeks. So in that 10-week period, although we do the traditional law enforcement, a lot of it, more than any other police academy, deals with the de-escalating situations and actually putting them in scenarios whereby they have to pass that scenario in order to graduate. And this is done from the day that they walk into the academy until the day that they leave. Now, the second issue is that
I don't want to, I don't mean to cut you off, and if you have more to answer, if you could submit that for the statement. But the other thing I want to address too, and maybe it's the stress on the officers themselves. You know, you have a shortage in your written statement, says 700 officers. Some of the facilities are undermanned by 20% and higher. I mean, how much overtime are these individuals working? How much stress is put on them? How much, if they're not working overtime, how undermanned are they where they're having to do so much more? What is the stress level of our officers over at the VA facilities?
We are looking, one of the efforts that we made with the introduction of the VISN level police officers is that's one of the things that they're taking a closer look at. What is our use of overtime, and how is that impacted by our vacancy rate? So we are, I do think it is something that we need to be concerned about. We're looking at it, and hopefully we can resolve it with the efforts that we're making to increase our staffing.
All right, I yield back my time.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Rose for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think as we analyze the threat landscape across the country, it's clear that our VA facilities are a top target for future terrorist attacks and instances of lone wolf shooters. If you really want to hit America's psyche and where it hurts, you should attack our VA. And so I've, in my capacity as Subcommittee Chairman of Intelligence and Counterterrorism on Homeland Security, really dug into what the NYPD is doing from a partnership basis, as well as other major law enforcement agencies. And I have not seen the VA participating in any of this. NYPD SHIELD program, monthly meetings, weekly meetings, so on and so forth. Can you speak to the partnerships that you all are engaging in, particularly from a counterterror standpoint, and potentially where you could improve?
I am not able to address that. I would have to submit that for the record. I apologize.
Okay. Does anyone have anything to speak to in terms of partnerships from what you're doing on a counterterror standpoint?
So let me just address one of the responsibilities of the VA police chief at the facility level is to build a relationship with the local law enforcement. And so one of those challenges is the ongoing threat of an active shooter. And so between VA police who train very specifically at the facility level to respond to that type of incident, we partner with local law enforcement. We also partner with the FBI in the area. So,
does every VA facility have a plan in place written to respond to an active shooter incident?
I would defer, my response would be yes. It is a requirement. And so I know they practice that because it is a real threat and a concern by everyone, the VA police, our employees, as well as the veterans coming to our facilities.
Okay. Moving on to the issue of suicide. We all are aware of these recent instances of suicides on VA campuses. From your experience, I know you all are looking into this issue, what are we doing well, and what can we do better?
You are right. We are looking very intensively at that. One of the things that I do need to share with you is that we have gotten to be a lot more proactive in looking at social media, for example, because one of the things that we're finding out as you discussed, many of people using the VA as a place where they would look to harm themselves, often post or are talking to people on social media. So we have really upped our review of that. And actually just last week, stopped somebody who had posted on Facebook and said where they were going to do this, that our police found them at the front door of that facility and were able to talk with them and get them admitted. I'm actually really glad you brought this up. Mr. Cisneros talked about Loma Linda, and I feel compelled to just share a story about Loma Linda. Back in March, a police dispatcher got a call from somebody who said that they were going to commit suicide. The policeman kept them on the phone and found out his location, which was on the 3rd floor of the parking garage at Loma Linda. This happened, I think, at 12:55. By 1:10, we had talked that individual down. We had brought other police there and a psychiatrist from the site. And so it was another save. So I think we're trying to do many of those things. What can we do to make sure that we're listening when veterans call and talk to us?
Is there any formal document related to what you're doing on social media? Any policy, SOP?
There is not an SOP that I am aware of.
Okay. So I just want to put two requests on the record for you all. If you could potentially try to put something on paper regarding social media, I think you're very correct to be focusing on that. And number two, if you could please make an effort to formally partner with what the NYPD is doing in the FBI in New York City, because we're not seen, and I think there's more to do because you are a target.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Bergman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We deal with a lot of words and phrases here, both in our testimony, verbal and written, and words and phrases count. Anytime we say no timelines, that means, in my mind, what I hear is no sense of urgency. Because if you don't have a specific timeline, you can't do markers against it. So I would urge specific timelines. Sometimes timelines are not met, but without a timeline, you don't know where you are in the process, and that's particularly confusing. And speaking of confusion, I've got 3 pages here of the wire diagram of just starting, with the Secretary of the VA down. That's, if you can understand this diagram, I think we have one step to the next step in success, which is the future organization of the VA and how we can get these things done with a sense of urgency. So, Mr. Missel, your testimony states responsibility for the police program is splintered between VHA and the VA Office of Operations, Security, and Preparedness. I'm curious about your use of the word splintered in that statement. Would you please explain what you mean by splintered?
What we found in the audit, that there were 2 different groups that had responsibility over the police force. And by using the word splintered, what we were trying to drive home is there was real confusion about who had what responsibility, and even within senior people, whether or not they were properly implementing that responsibility. We found a general awareness with some people of what they should have been doing here, and this is such an important area. For it to work properly, the governance structure has to be very solid. And in this situation, we found that there was confusion, and given how disparate the 2 groups were, having confusion just exasperates the problem.
So being splintered kind of added to the confusion.
Correct.
Ms. Schinsky, in your written testimony, you state that officers are matrixed to OSLE and that OSLE has tacit oversight of all police units in the field. What do you mean by matrixed to OSLE and tacit oversight? And do you think that this contributes to the confusion identified by the IG?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. So by matrixed, I believe we're talking about the idea that we do this as a partnership. Honestly, as we try to do law enforcement in a healthcare environment, we need to have both sides represented in a review of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So while there may be the direct line authority at the medical center, there's also authority within OSLE to make sure that people are trained, that to make sure that if there are any issues, that they help to determine how we overcome those. Anytime there is an issue with use of force, that automatically goes to OSLE. There is nothing that is further done by medical center leadership about anything like that. So there are specific areas that belong to OSLE and some areas that belong to the medical center.
Okay. Yeah, I would suggest to you that a police force kind of resembles the military in that it has a specific chain of command. So when you're executing a plan or when things go bad, people know whose responsibility is what. And that specific chain of command goes a long way towards having a more effective police force. Ms. Schinsky, in your written testimony, you say that VA believes that there is a need for additional staff. I want to explore that for a minute here. We regularly hear that VA has between 35 to 40,000 vacancies. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but Congress funds those vacant positions through the annual appropriation, which means that VA has the money to fill the approximately 700 vacant police officer positions. How did VA determine that it needs additional staff when it has 700 vacancies and has not completed its police staffing model?
One of the areas I think, that, at least from the initial overview, is we do not have a good career path where we can encourage people to stay at the VA and to become leaders in police.
Does a career path, and I see I'm over in my time, I hope we're going to get a second round, but my next I'll yield back, but my next question is, do we need a career path to hire someone initially? And I yield back.
Thank you. We'll get to that in round two. Our colleague, Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, has asked to participate in today's subcommittee hearing, and I would like to request unanimous consent to allow him to join us on the dais. And if there are no objections, I'd like to recognize Congressman Moulton for 5 minutes. Hearing no objection, you're recognized, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Henrietta, I've entered into the record reporting from the Boston Globe about an incident at the Bedford VA in Massachusetts where an off-duty officer drove drunk to a car dealership, ran out of gas, demanded to be filled up by the car dealership, and when they refused, threatened the car dealership employees with a gun. After he was arrested, he cursed out the local cops, stuffed the holding cell with toilet paper, and beat his own head against a cell door. Now, he had previously been dismissed from the state troopers, had his gun permit revoked by the town during a domestic incident complaint, and had 2 sexual harassment charges filed against him. This exemplary officer was selected to be an instructor at the VA's police academy. So, can you just help me understand how that would happen? How this man, of all people, would be sent to the elite VA police academy?
So that current situation is currently under investigation. The way we work together with VHA is when a VA police officer is identified for either criminal conduct or performance, then the Office of Security and Law Enforcement sends a special agent down to take an independent look at the situation. In this particular case, at the time of his selection, we were not aware of all of the background circumstances. Immediately, that offer was rescinded, and again, it's currently, to the best of my knowledge, and I'll defer to Mr. Jackson, under investigation based on his behavior.
Sir, I'm glad to hear it's under investigation. It's my understanding that perhaps part of the reason why you did not understand all those allegations is that the chief of the Bedford VA police at the time, Sean Kelly, was shielding the man from scrutiny. And that's until the Boston Globe Spotlight team inquired about the incident. This gentleman, Sean Kelly, I understand, is now under consideration to be the chief of VA police in Manchester, New Hampshire. Is that true?
So let me refer to Mr. Jackson, because I know he is intimately involved with this case.
Okay. Mr. Jackson.
Sir, I know nothing about him going to another area to be a chief of police. Nothing at all. This is that would be news to myself. But secondly, also while he did go down to the law enforcement training center, he was never an instructor because he had to shadow some of the experts first before being fully authorized.
Well, Mr. Jackson, I'm glad to hear that. I have no idea why this man would even wear the uniform, period. Now, I'm also aware that, using Bedford as an example, that despite the fact that the VA in Bedford has a larger police force than the town of Bedford, than the one that protects the entire community, every time the VA Bedford police force makes an arrest, they have to call the Bedford police to do it because they don't actually have the authority to, I may perhaps messing up the precise terminology here, but they don't have the authority to actually have that arrest. So you have a VA police force in charge of a small fraction of the number of people in the town, and they don't even have arrest authority. So, I mean, I guess my fundamental question is, why does this force even exist? I mean, shouldn't we just be paying a little bit of this money, a small portion of the $3 million budget of the VA Police Department every year, just to the Bedford Police Department, which have to, it seems like they have to do all their work anyway, including dealing with the discipline of VA officers? Ms. Schinsky, would you like to take that?
Yes, thank you. One of the things, just to emphasize, you're right, we don't do arrest authority on the VA campuses. We've been talking about how what our police do is really try to balance security and healthcare in the same environment, and the de-escalation techniques. I recognize that there seems to be some variance with what you do in the community. Anytime we find anything criminal, it goes to the OIG. So we really are trying to keep a safe and secure environment, not community policing.
Well, I'm over time, but I would just suggest that if the hallmark of the VA police is their de-escalation techniques, that doesn't seem to be what was employed by this officer when he couldn't get gas from a car dealership when he was driving drunk. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moulton, and I hope that the VA could confirm that information about a potential transfer for the committee if that in fact has taken place.
We will, thank you.
Well, thank you. We'd like to have some additional questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Missel, I wanted to address something that was brought up in the testimony from the VA. OSLE has, quote, tacit oversight over all of the VA police units in the field. And I'm wondering if you could help me understand that term, how that fits into the current model of your governance structure, and whether or not you feel that that is a sufficient model.
In our report, we identified issues with the governance structure. I don't know the term tacit oversight. What I would say is they certainly have responsibility to inspect the police, to identify any issues that they find. One of the things we identified in our report was that they were late in their inspections, which obviously hinders their oversight. The actual oversight of the individual police force, though, goes through VHA, and they have the direct authority.
Could you talk a little bit about other police units and federal agencies, how they're structured? I know your report brought up a couple of examples of Federal Protective Service and the U.S. Park Police. How does that compare to what we're seeing in the VA?
We were looking at those other services more for the number of officers and in terms of what they were covering, what their jurisdiction was, as opposed to their actual structure. VA is unique the way it is organized from other federal agencies, so it's really hard to compare.
Okay. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the pay incentives that exist to help recruit and retain officers. First, I just want to acknowledge that the subcommittee received a written statement from the American Federation of Government Employees, which represents many VA employees, and I ask unanimous consent that we include that statement for the record. Ms. Schinsky, as you consider steps to reduce vacancies, are you in discussion with labor representatives?
Those discussions would be at the local level, not at the national level. So there may be discussions ongoing at the various sites as we put out different advertisements. And also, just responding to some of the things you were saying, also the special salary rates and trying to look at what is happening in the community, if we're having trouble retaining. And I think there is a difference. You can often hire people in, but to retain them, once we've trained them down at the LETC, trying to keep them often requires that we go out and do special salary rates.
Are there any constraints, statutorily speaking, or any others that might exist that need to be addressed for the VA's pay scale to become more competitive?
A couple of things that we are doing is, as I was talking earlier, it may not have come across, but as we do position descriptions, making sure that we have people graded at the right level. One of the things that we've done is raise the entry level to a GS6 so that you are looking at a higher level than at a 5. Just finding that the comparison to the private sector, which is where we get many of our police officers. 85% of our police are veterans. So they often have experience in the military, or they may have worked in a local community policing agency. So we have to do more to make sure that our rates are competitive. So we're looking both at special salary rates and what are the entry level and then the steps up the chain.
And how has that trended over time? Where things stand today in terms of the vacancy rate, if we look back 1 year, 5 years, how have we gotten to this point today?
I will have to submit that for the record.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for your responses there, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Mast for 5 minutes if he has additional questions.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I want to step back on something that Mr. Moulton was speaking about. I wanted to get to it earlier, but I want to make sure I have the numbers correct in what you were saying. There are currently 4,000 filled VA police force positions and 700 vacancies. Am I understanding that correctly? So the total full up would be 4,700 roughly?
Roughly, yes.
So at 4,000 by 139 facilities, we're talking about roughly 28 officers per facility. Would that be a rough average, or would you see these dispersed in a little bit different way?
Well, the number of individuals at the site obviously is going to be based on the size of the numbers of people who are there, the size of the campuses, and as we talked about, security vulnerabilities that may exist at some places or not exist at others.
Could you give me an example of one of the larger facilities that has, say, the most officers versus one of the smaller facilities that has a more minimal number of officers of that 139?
You would be looking at places that perhaps have multiple campuses, a Palo Alto, California.
How many officers might they have?
I would have to look at what that might be.
Okay. So on average, so if we move that up to 4,700, we'd be looking at what we could place 33 per facility if we did that. Is it that there are not enough officers? Is that not enough? Mr. Moulton, he did reference the fact that in some of his cities, that's more officers that are in law enforcement for an entire city on a VA campus, on a single VA campus, maybe multiple campuses, but that's quite a few officers.
So one of the things that we are doing is trying to develop that staffing model to address these very items. There may be things with vulnerabilities where we need more. There may be places where we need less. So we are doing a staffing assessment. We're going to be using, I think we had talked about the data that had been put together by Homeland Security and assessing those. That will be considered, and we hope to have those staffing models completed by September 30th.
Thank you. And to go back to something that you referenced, I want to make sure that I understand this correctly. You said in response to the shooting in West Palm Beach, VA, that individuals coming into the hospital in a wheelchair would be, or a scooter, some sort of mobility platform, would be removed from their mobility platform, moved into a hospital mobility platform, wheelchair, something to that effect, whatever it may be. Do you mean anybody and everybody coming into the facility, or just those going into the ER?
Just those going into the emergency department.
What do you see is the difference in terms of threat assessment between somebody going into the ER versus somebody coming in a mobility platform and anywhere else? Not that I by any means think this is the most well thought through approach to doing this, but in the threat assessment, what is the difference?
And I would have to look into that in more detail, so I would have to get back to you. I do think that some of the issue, honestly, you know, when we talk about staffing levels, is then having people be able to transport folks. So I think we're looking at probably a staging as we do that. I know often when you go to a community hospital, you are put in their chairs when you go there, so I think that really is probably what's happening in the community as well.
I've done threat assessment very specifically as my work prior to a member of Congress on a number of different fronts with different agencies. And I see absolutely no difference in terms of the threat of whether somebody is going into the ER for perhaps some sort of trauma. If we're talking about some instance of being institutionalized for mental health counseling, that might be different, but I see no difference in the threat of somebody coming into the ER versus another part of the facility in terms of what they could bring in that would pose a threat to people within the hospital or patients within the hospital, anybody else. So what I would like to ask of you is, would you please be willing to give me a brief, come into my office, give me a brief on everything that has been put into place, since we're not going to be able to cover all of this?
Certainly.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, Mr. Jackson, you would be the appropriate person for me to start with these questions. So there were findings by your agency that the officers reacted in Mr. Telford's case in an appropriate way. And the writing, the way that they come to the conclusion, it just seemed very perfunctory, and like there was not going to be any other outcome other than the police acted accordingly. I just want to know if you can explain to me why you think it was appropriate, first of all, to take the physical action that they did against Mr. Telford and hold him down, knowing that he was, because he told them that he had just had spinal surgery, et cetera, and he was in pain, couldn't breathe. And then further, why they issued those summonses to go to federal court, which now have, for all intents and purposes, been dismissed.
Yes, ma'am. When the incident happened on the 6th, and I saw a letter that came in from your office, I think within 2 days later we were there, because one incident of the use of force is one too many. One of our special agents talked to Mr. Telford for at least a couple hours or so and got with him immediately. The issue there was with the collection of the evidence and the other witnesses that said what Mr. Telford did. That was the conclusion after gathering all the evidence we didn't have any video, just the witnesses that came forward and said, well, based upon what the police said to him and what Mr. Telford said, the witnesses thought that the officers acted properly. Now, I think to further that along, what we have done to improve, working with VHA to improve healthcare professionals dealing with veterans is our verbal defense and a healthcare training that we've gone out to do to give so many employees that deal with veterans. So the first reaction is not to call the police, but to diffuse the situation before calling the police.
So I agree with you, and I think I turn to Ms. Schinsky to talk about that. The medical support assistant is the first line of defense in terms of any de-escalation that may be necessary. And I think forgetting about what the police did once they were called, it seems to me that it's uncontroverted that the MSA was in a unique position to de-escalate the situation by just addressing his frustration and understanding that this is a man in pain. And it doesn't seem like any de-escalation attempts were made at that level. Do people in those positions, medical support assistants, get de-escalation trainings too, since they really are on the front lines, and you don't get to a police situation unless you have an MSA or someone in that position to call them?
Before I answer, I just have to say how difficult it was to listen to what you described during your discussion, and I'm so sorry about what happened, and I wish we could go back and do it over again. Yeah. But going back to the MSA, yes, they do get some de-escalation training. I think one of the issues with those individuals is they are that front face to veterans, and we need to make sure that we are doing the right things related to customer service, related to...
They are all about,
Yes.
to me, if they don't do proper customer service, what's their job?
Right.
They're actually not the ones giving the healthcare treatment. They're not doctors. They are simply there to address the specific needs that are right in front of them. And you can understand someone in Mr. Telfor's situation being frustrated. I still haven't gotten an answer as to why it was okay for him to get PT and OT in a community setting and then have the rug pulled out from under him and said, no, you have to go back to a VA facility, and then go to that facility and be told, we can't give you that kind of care here. You have to go to the hospital, which is an hour and a half away. I mean, the level, I have not been well, some people think I probably should be diagnosed with, anyone who works here should be diagnosed with that. But here is a person who has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he just at every step of the way, from the time that he was getting the treatment that he needed to have the rug pulled out from under him, is just, so, and I'm not holding you responsible for that. I'm still trying to get answers as to why that happened. But let me just, because my time is almost up, it is up, just one quick question. I am so troubled by the fact that someone, and it's not even clear from the documentation that I have gotten, someone accessed his medical records and put defamatory information in them that was proven to be factually incorrect. To me, there is no amount of retraining that that person can undergo to understand that that was not a training issue. That was this person trying to cover their behind and put in information that was intentionally false to put them in a better light and the victim in a worse light. And so to me, I don't know if you're the right person to ask this to, but that person should be terminated. If you violate a sacrosanct rule that you are not allowed to access someone's medical records, unless it's for purposes of putting in what treatment you've just given them. That was not the case here. So I would ask, maybe we can follow up after this hearing on that, because I haven't gotten sufficient, I don't think, retraining someone like that is the answer. It's not a retraining, it's an ethics issue. So I would appreciate it if we could follow up after this hearing.
Yes.
Thank you, and I apologize again for going over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ranking Member Bergman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Moulton pointed out in his example, the VA hired an officer who had been dismissed from the state police and had his gun privileges, his weapons privileges pulled for domestic violence. Have you or anyone in the VA reviewed the medical center's HR department to understand and correct problems in the screening process? I mean, how did this fall through the crack? Any thoughts?
It is frustrating, obviously, for us as well. We have looked at screening processes,
Did you look at this one in specific?
not this one in specific.
Okay, I would suggest then, rather than, this is an example where we can go into specifics and then go back to generalities, as opposed to generalities to work towards specifics. So please take that for action. Mr. Missel, recommendation 4, number 4 of your December 2018 report concerned the hiring of additional OSLE investigation staff. OSLE has hired 9 of the 10 additional authorized employees, yet the recommendation remains open. Is this sufficient to close out the recommendation? In other words, is 9 out of 10 good enough? And if not, what remains for VA to do before you will close that recommendation?
With respect to that recommendation, what we asked for was an assessment. So we don't know if 9, 10 is the right number. When we make a recommendation, we typically ask for documentation about what the plan is to complete what needs to be done. And my understanding is, as of now, we have not yet gotten that assessment. We asked about it. As soon as we see that assessment, if it's satisfactory, we may be able to close this recommendation.
Okay. Ms. Schinsky, your written testimony states that there were 375 officers who left VA in FY18. Later in that paragraph, you state that the number 2 reason for officers leaving was a lack of opportunity for advancement. Would you please elaborate on that lack of opportunity for advancement for the police?
One of the issues has been that we talk about a career ladder. So detective, inspector, assistant chief, chief. One of the things that happens is that you can't give people enough opportunities to move up. And so what we're trying to look at is what is the appropriate level, how much supervision do we need? And I think we have pointed out here there are multiple opportunities where we can improve how we do business, some of that by how we supervise those individuals, so that we give people an opportunity to move up. When it feels like people are not moving out of chief positions and there's nowhere for someone to go, they begin to look at jobs in the community. Because once they have some of these credentials, they certainly are able to qualify for jobs with other law enforcement agencies.
Okay, Ms. Schinsky, would you please provide the committee an example or two of the evidence-based practices from other federal agencies and private industries that you have incorporated into the police program?
One of the things that we are now trying to do in regard to hiring, we were looking at how do private sector facilities, because I think, as Mr. Missel so aptly talked about, it's difficult sometimes to look at other federal agencies because VA is very different. To look at other healthcare agencies, how do they hire their armed guards? Because about half of the hospitals around the country do have them. What we're finding and what we are now beginning to implement is a two-pronged approach to interview process. The first interview would be with individuals who are law enforcement oriented to make sure that people meet those basic law enforcement qualifications. The second interview panel, and the people who make it through that panel would go to a second panel, which would look at what is their fit in a healthcare environment? How do they fit in our mechanism of using de-escalation as the primary way of doing this? How would they recognize someone who is suffering from mental illness who may be in danger of suicide? So that is a major one that I think we are implementing right now.
Okay, and I see my time is about up. I'd just like to ask one question, if you'd please. I'm guessing you don't have this information at your fingertips, so please take it for the record. But with nearly 700 vacancies in the police services, I'm quite curious as to whether VA police officers eligible to join the union, and if so, how many police officers receive a taxpayer-funded union time. So if you'd take that for the record, I'd appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. Just a couple closing points before we conclude the hearing. I'd just first like to underscore the nonpartisan nature of the issues and questions regarding the department's police force, and I really look forward to working with Ranking Member Bergman and all of our subcommittee members on both sides of the aisle as we continue to monitor developments, review policies, receive additional reports, and press for improvements, which is really essential. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. Inspector General Missel, I would like to express thanks to you and your staff for the ongoing oversight work in this critical area. Your report on the VA policing policies and today's testimony represent critical findings and, as we heard, has already made a positive impact. Our subcommittee staff will keep in close touch with you with the ongoing audits of VA policing. And to Ms. Schinsky, Mr. Henretta, and Mr. Jackson, I thank you for your testimony as well. Your appearance today clearly represents a willingness for the department to work with Congress to move forward to improving the policies and resources of the VA's police. Please also convey on behalf of the subcommittee our thanks to the work of the many officers and staff throughout the VA police force. Members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.